Hey, everybody. Welcome to the latest installment of MSP Business School. As always, I'm one of your hosts here, Brian Doyle. And with me, as I do every week, I've got Tim McNeil and Rob Rogers from over at OSR Manage.
Right.
What's going on, guys? What's the good word today?
Living the dream.
Got the kids back in school. It's a good day.
Yeah, we've got kids started. My oldest started kindergarten. Rob and I just got back from a quarterly peer group meeting, so it's been an interesting 10 days.
Timmy, it took you only 35 seconds to make me feel old on this call. Thank you. Tim's got kids starting kindergarten. I was just getting chewed out about college speech classes before I got on the call today. So, living in two different vortexes, right? But today I want to introduce our special guest. We've got Chris Johnson with us, and many of you might know Chris Johnson. He is one of the leading cybersecurity specialists out in the marketplace today, working with a lot of MSPs, helping them reach market and certainly evangelizing a lot of what's going on in the cybersecurity space. So, Chris, welcome to the show.
Welcome,
hey,
sir.
Thanks for having me.
So, Chris, we always like to start this off with a little bit of backstory, right? We want to know how people got, or how you got from here to there. So if you wouldn't mind, tell us, in a little bit about your backstory and, how you came to be an advisor within the cyberspace.
Sure. I think it was one of those things I fell into that trap. I look back at the career path that I was on. So I started out in IT back in the early 2000s, like many of us did. I remember last week you bringing up the Silverback days, and I remember those days. That's where I met several of the people that are still involved in the channel today.
So for those of you that don't know what Chris is talking about, I got the opportunity to guest on his podcast, MSP 1337. So I'll do a little shout out there. You should go check him out there, and of course, you should check out my episode with him.
Absolutely. So funny enough, I fell into the world of IT, and the first job I had was with a company that actually handed me the little MSDN card that said, these are the 5 incidents you can call Microsoft about. And that's how I started being in the IT space. Fast forward, I said I could do IT better than the company I was working for. So I went out on my own, started my own company. This was during the .com crash. Or not the .com crash, the housing market crash of 2008.
Yep.
So perfect timing to start a company, right? And so our idea was we're going to just take on all business because it pays the bills, and we will be the jack of all trades, master of none. Mm-hmm. And about 2 years into that, we discovered that there was this huge demand in California from a healthcare perspective. And even though the prospects were like, we're just driving this from an IT standpoint, like needing help, their need for help was a paper model, like that had been a paper model with patient charts and all of that suddenly was being driven to become digital, and to do so very quickly. And so it was very lucrative. And a couple of years into that, we're like, wait a second, this doesn't really feel like a model that I want to be a part of if I can't start focusing on some of the security elements and really have the clients and client prospects sort of participate in that. So we spent like the next 6-7 years, like heavy focused on HIPAA compliance, focused on securities, control frameworks. And so from there to selling my MSP, I continue to go more and more laser focused. So this last gig I had before I kind of stepped away from managed services was I was doing it with banks, like laser focused, Fortune 100, Fortune 500 banks, like evaluate our branch office and tell us what's wrong. I loved it. I learned real quickly that going from SMB to enterprise is a whole different conversation because it's less about how much are we spending and it's how good are you at what you do.
Yeah.
Last guy was in here, he charges $100,000 and you're saying you can do this for 10. Yeah, we don't think you're qualified then. It's like, sorry, let me redo the numbers and the commas, right? So anyways, I went completely away from that. I said, I don't want to do this anymore. And one day, for those of you who don't know, Steve Alexander had been a friend of mine for a while. I'd been in his peer group when I had an MSP. He reached out and said, Chris, I've got MSPs, and the one thing that they are struggling with that I think you can help them with is how to position cybersecurity products and services with their clients. And that has kind of put me back into being involved on a regular basis through the podcast that I run, being involved with Secure Outcomes and the MSP Ignite peer groups. And that's kind of been that trajectory over the last, almost 20 years.
Wow.
Oh,
Thanks
wow.
for sharing a
Okay.
little bit of the backstory, because it's always great to hear how people arrived in this crazy world of IT that many of us of mine in your generation fell into, not Tim. He probably did it on purpose.
Also, I don't think this is fair. You're aging me too. I was 22 in 2001. So just wanting to be clear about that.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, Chris. I've deeply offended everybody. And once again, I am the oldest guy in this show, man.
First season.
2000, you were 22? All right, so you're a year older than I am. All right, there we are. I'm still the youngest, but not by much. Not by much.
Chris, so I got a question for you. So you're working with Steve a lot, and
Yeah.
he's calling you in. Is he calling you in when people want to investigate that side of the market for themselves, or when they have an issue and like they gotta turn on a dime and like they do the red line and call you immediately?
So that's kind of interesting to MSP Ignite. So he runs peer groups, and I was in peer group beta, which was the first peer group. I was in there for almost 5-6 years. Obviously, if you're not an MSP, it's kind of pointless to be in an MSP, peer group. And so he reached out because he was specifically working with one peer group who had, like you said, it was like the issue with like, this is what I'm struggling with. That in and of itself sort of sparked this idea that maybe, for lack of a better word, a peer group, and we didn't want to call it that because we're like, we don't want MSPs joining MSP Ignite so they can join a secure outcomes or a cybersecurity focused peer group, because that's too laser focused.
Got it.
Now, that's not saying that couldn't change in the future, but the idea was, what if you put together something that said, as a part of being a member of the peer groups, that secure outcomes would be this sort of thing that you had access to. So partly was me, partly is the advisory council that kind of evolved out of it. So like they can hit us up on like Teams channels and some other stuff. The podcast is public facing. We do some marketing stuff that it's also public facing, but really wanting to make sure that the members had access to resources in the cybersecurity focus that was driven by somebody who's like, I know what you're dealing with. This is unique to MSPs, because every framework that you look at out there was like, hey, let's write a compliance framework and focus on the managed services space and see how well that plays out when they go to implement. And that was really kind of that launching for us to, or for me to go, I want to give this back. Now, granted, I want to also get paid. No one wants to be like a volunteer forever. But at the end of the day, I am doing this because I want to give back. In fact, I did it for a full year for completely like no compensation. Like there was nothing financially involved at all. I just was excited to have these conversations and be able to provide insight on a problem that someone had, that while I may not have the exact experience that they're going through, I could at least talk through some of it.
Very cool. So are you actually going in and helping the MSPs in specific situations? Are you just advising them during the sales process or when they're having these conversations with these clients? Like, what does that look like?
So I guess you could say it's a combination. So I have some MSPs who have gone outside of peer group. They're like, we just want you to help me on a weekly basis with us becoming more mature with our cybersecurity journey. And that can be a separate engagement depending on how deep they want to go. Mm-hmm. A lot of it is tied to, hey, we're having this conversation with a client. We're not really sure how to proceed and get the client to understand that this is serious and it's got accountability to it. That's not just us. And so I go, okay, well, why don't you just tell them that you want to leverage your CISO on the next call you have? I'd be happy to join you. No cost involved because you're a member of the peer group. And let's just see how the conversation changes when they realize that you've hired a security advisor to help you with them. Changes the dynamics 100%. I can be the worst at cybersecurity or the best. It doesn't matter. It changes the client's perspective because they now understand that you as an MSP are spending money to have somebody else participate in the conversation.
Yep.
I think that's a critical step, right? With MSPs, it's really, you've got to evolve the perception with your client through doing steps like that, bringing in another person. Because if you just show up with the same team that's been supporting that customer consistently over time, and now you want to shift the conversation to higher level security thought, it just doesn't vibe well if the person's really just been your operational guy working on servers prior to that. And that's no knock on that guy. It's just it's a customer perception. To your point, you don't have to be good or bad per se. You just have to be designated, right? And that's really what it comes down to.
Well, just think about CIO Toolbox as an example. We talk about that term all the time in the managed services space. You're an account manager, you're the CIO, you're the whatever that you've been given. The trusted advisor is another one that gets used a lot. And the problem with a lot of these naming conventions isn't whether or not they're useful or valuable. It's that they're often associated with something that is not tied to the qualifications of the person in that role. It's tied to someone has to do it. Why not the account manager? Right. And so now all of a sudden it's tied to client X. You need to upgrade security Y because we just ripped out all of our other clients. They're happy with the new choice. You should be happy with it too. And it doesn't have that conversation that says, we're doing this because we want you to be more secure. We're doing this because there's a value proposition for your business to be protected, as opposed to, I'm just the guy that's got to sell you more stuff.
Yeah, and that's a big part of it is that protection piece. And really, it's also the confidence from the customer, right?
Sure.
If your sales rep is the only person talking security to the customer, you're going to lose, and you're going to lose 10 times out of 10. Completely. Because that salesperson is already viewed as a salesperson. He might be great. They might value his consultative skills. They might understand he knows the industry, but at the end of the day, their feeling is still that guy's compensated by more that he does with me. And he's not doing it strictly out of a place of benevolence, right? It's really, a little bit of a hidden agenda to it, right? So, certainly from my seat, when I'm working with customers, I'm always like, look, you want to get your engineers involved in the creation of these reports. You want to make sure that the people that are going out to present are in the right roles. You never want your hunters involved with it. Maybe your account managers, if they've evolved, but that has to become their full-time role. It's just about client advocacy, client management. And if they're not feeling the client advocacy piece, it's tough to gain the trust otherwise, right?
Well, you said something that I think is really important, hunting versus gathering, right? So if you were to ask me point blank, what does a cybersecurity advisor do? I help gather the information so that you can be successful in your cybersecurity journey, as opposed to threat intelligence to try and tell you from a forensic standpoint why bad things keep happening to you.
So how have you seen, I would assume over the last 18 to 20 months, there's been a pretty big shift in the conversations that you're having, not that the conversations themselves have been different, but the volume of them. Like how much more open are you seeing people at this point compared to, pre-COVID?
Sure. So I think there's been some recent examples that have really changed actually the conversation, or maybe have previously people were a little bit silent or accepting with reservation, or like, I'm going to do the trust but verify now with a vendor that's had a problem. So we saw it play out a little bit for the MSPs, Kaseya, whether you were a Kaseya customer or not, you had a huge pause, right? Like everybody was on kind of pins and needles, like what's going to happen next? Good, bad, or otherwise, where we are today. Then recently you saw the T-Mobile, the AT&T, and then of course you had the let's regurgitate the Verizon historical, how they handled things. And what's I think different today in the conversation is what can we do to be part of a solution as opposed to just accepting our circumstances, right? We're an SMB, we have 10 employees. How do we put the screws to any of these large giant companies? And I think we came to the conclusion it's like we don't. But that doesn't mean we play by the same rules of acceptance like we did before, because in platforms like this, the podcast that I have, we actually got to talking about like your organizations, like your ASCIIs and some of these others, like what happens when there's becomes a collective voice that says, we're no longer going to just say, you provide a solution to a problem that I have with my clients. I don't need to do anything else like vet or verify what data do you actually need access to. I'm now really engaged with, I'm not so quick to just sign paperwork that says because I was at a conference, and giving me 20% off, that's good enough, right? Like I want to see like how you operate. What are your security initiatives? Do we really row in the same direction, or are we at opposite ends of sort of this idea of like we don't do two-factor authentication? And as a MSP, I've got to think about that too, because if you're not accessing data that's really personal and private that has meaning to somebody else, do I really need to be so concerned about 2FA with that same data? And I think that's the other side of this, right? Like, I'm not using that vendor. They don't do 2FA. Okay, well, what data do they collect from you? Oh, nothing. Okay, you know, like the water service. It's like, man, we got to use 2FA before I'm going to place an order for, you know, sparkling water, right? That's just not how we operate. Yet that's kind of a mentality we're starting to take on because fear and, you know, the FUD factor is happening.
Yeah. So, you know, I've seen a lot with cybersecurity insurance and all the different things that, you know, people have to sign. And, you know, they give these long worksheets that people, then they always give them to the MSP and say, hey, fill this out. I just got this from my insurance company and don't mess it up. And if you do, coming after you. But I don't want to do all this extra work. Have you seen like an uptick in the differentiation between those types of worksheets? And, you know, what do you recommend to, you know, your members about what you have to do here?
So this gets into a slippery slope because now we're talking about what insurance is asking for questions. And like, here's what I will say. They're all different. They're all the same, right? So there's obviously going to be a different type of pain, if you will, if you're answering a questionnaire in rears, like you've had an insurance claim and now they're asking you to fill this out, is completely different than you are looking to get insurance and they ask you to fill out a questionnaire. I can be a little bit more, I'll say loosey-goosey on my answers if I'm for the first time applying for insurance and I don't have a historical track record of like, well, every January we have the same breach happen. I go buy Amazon gift cards and I give them to people I don't know because that's what I was told to do. And then my boss is really angry with me, but that's what I do every January, right? I'm the Santa Claus in our company, right?
That's right.
That being said, from a financial standpoint, or just any of the pieces of this model with insurance is tied directly to when they ask questions that don't give you, please explain. That's where the problem is right now. So like, you know, in lieu of the CASEA, this is not something that was triggered by CASEA, but can you imagine now when you get that insurance document, it says, do you use an RMM? And you're like, yes. They're like, is the vendor, what is the name of that vendor? And you're like, I don't want to tell you. And then the next question is it on-prem or is it in the cloud? And you're like, I also don't want to tell you, right? Like it's a yes, no toggle. It's not a please fill in the blank and explain. So I think those are some challenges. And then you go further down and one of the questions always is 2FA needs to be turned on everything. And they'll give specifics like turning it on for your switches, firewalls, routers, access points. And you're like, those are not physically doable things. So now you ask yourself this question, do I say, no, I can't do that the way the question's written? Or do you say yes, because maybe you've put in place, like in order to get on the VLAN to manage those devices, it requires two-factor authentication. So that's not how it's worded in the questionnaire, and it's not asking you how you are achieving it. So that's where I would get into with a client that's struggling to answer some of those questions. Like, how do we creatively answer this question truthfully, but not put you in a position to not get insurance, period, because you said no?
Right. Yeah, you're right. It's a slippery slope right now, especially with all the different types of you know, the cybersecurity insurance out there and the worksheets, and like some of them are getting pretty detailed. They're starting to catch up.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, you know, we've talked about in the past, there's litigation coming into play now that's going to help foster that a little bit. Because if you can adopt some common controls, you know, states like Connecticut, Ohio, and Utah have already put this in, and I'm sure more that will follow, which will help standardize that. It still is going to be intense, but it's going to be standardized. It's going to be easy to repeat, and it's going to be easy to coach to as well. Yeah. Chris, agree. We are hitting the end of our time. Unfortunately, this has been a great conversation, and we'll have to have you back to continue it.
Sure.
As we move forward. But, you know, do you have any closing thoughts you want to share with the MSP community there before we, you know, wind down?
I think the one thing to share with any MSP that's listening to this is whether it's working internally or with vendors, do your due diligence, right? because I think that's where we all get in trouble. Is if I work with a client and they haven't done due diligence on me, expectations are going to be, they're going to miss. And I think that's where all of us end up dealing with the repercussions of the one who failed, and all the rest of us around are dealing with picking up the pieces, even though it wasn't directly targeted at me. So that's what I would leave with everybody. And of course, like you said, if you're listening to this show, then you probably should also be listening to MSP 1337, where you guys are more than welcome to join anytime.
All right, well, thank you. And that's a great segue, Chris. I really appreciate it. And thanks for joining us here today. And I think I'm definitely going to take you up on that. Sure. MSP, 1337. Hey, what is that? I'm just curious. What is that?
1337. So 337. So this was an inside thing for years. 1337 is geek speak for elite.
Okay.
So we, for a number of years, we have a Slack channel that has MSP 1337. The idea was you always want to do better. And so by throwing that out there internally, especially, we used to use that kind of like people might use the 212 model, like go beyond the boiling point to customer service. We kind of said, as an MSP, that's raising the bar to the next level.
Okay. Cool. Very good. All right. For anyone that's looking to get in touch with Chris, we will be including his LinkedIn profile with the podcast. And also this episode will be up on mspbusinessschool.com and anywhere you get your podcast. Chris, appreciate it. Fellas, as always, really appreciate you joining us today. And we'll talk to you next time, everybody.
Thanks for coming on, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.